Hello and welcome to 5 Frames From. Today I'm talking about the 2006 film This Is England, directed by Shane Meadows. Now I say the film was released in 2006, but perhaps a more significant date would be 1983, which is when this film is set. And the date that the film is set is really important to the look and style of the film. The 80s are not just a backdrop to this film, they are central to everything that goes on and to what the characters are experiencing. Before we get onto that though, we should perhaps talk a little bit about Shane Meadows because his films are better understood if you know a bit about his background. And this film in particular is known to be his most personal. So Shane Meadows comes from a working class family. His dad was a lorry driver. He grew up in Uttoxeter, a small town in the Midlands. And if you read interviews with Shane Meadows, you'll see that he talks about how his films often come from events that happened in his past. And in a couple of his films, they're about him sort of growing up and the experiences that he had. His own working class background and his desire to tell personal stories means that most of the films that he has made have been set in working class communities. But what we often find is that there is a character who perhaps feels some alienation within that community. For example, Sean in This Is England is bullied at the beginning and becomes part of the group maybe for protection. And in his film Room for Romeo, Brass, one of the boys, is bedridden for quite a long time, and his friend Romeo has to find friendship elsewhere, in this case with an unsuitable older guy played by Paddy Considine. So that idea of forming friendships which perhaps aren't that positive or even inappropriate, we might consider them today. And that's very similar to Sean's relationship with Combo. We would definitely consider Shane Meadows to be an auteur because across his body of work we can see similar ideas and themes being developed. They're shot in similar ways and he works with the same kind of cast and crew. Key characteristics include working within the new British social realism genre. Films that demonstrate this type of realism perhaps are slightly more cinematic and slightly more poetic than earlier social realism by directors like Ken Loach. But if you wanted to compare a film to This Is England, have a look at Ken Loach's Kes to see a similar sort of coming of age story. So Shane Meadows is known for working hard with his actors. He'll often cast unknown actors, work really hard with them, lots of rehearsal, and giving them some freedom to improvise during the films. You'll notice people like Stephen Graham, Vicky McClure, Andrew Shim popping up in his work over and over again, and he also works with the same writer. In recent years, Shane Meadows has directed more for television, so This Is England has got 3 follow-up series following the same stories of the characters that we meet in the film. But he's also directed dramas like The Virtues, also starring Stephen Graham. So I would recommend that you go away and have a little more of a look at some of his work just to spot those auteur characteristics. My first frame is this one of Roland Rat from the opening montage. Now this might seem like an odd choice considering that montage has got loads of political images of Thatcher and images of war, which might create a much more serious tone. But I wanted to point out early on that this film, although it's dealing with a very serious subject matter and there's some heartbreaking scenes, there's also a lot of humour in this film as well, a sort of dark humour. And I think that's part of the binary oppositions that make up the film. This film is full of opposites, and having Roland Rat alongside Thatcher is just one of them. Another reason why I've chosen this particular shot is because it symbolises childhood, and I think there are plenty of times in the film where we are reminded that Sean is a child. He's very young. Some of his behaviour suggests it, some of the things he experiences, but he is also growing up and living in a grown-up's world, and he's drawn into these very grown-up political viewpoints. So I think this image of Roland Rat and the other ones that follow really sets the scene in terms of that binary of youth versus age and experience. I think it's worth noting here that this montage really creates a sense of the 80s perfectly. The use of that archive footage, and it's different archive footage with different tones and moods, creates this idea of sort of collective experience together. In the 80s, people were experiencing these things all together. And Roland Rat was on a Saturday morning. Lots of children would have watched it. There were no other kind of children's programmes, weren't any dedicated channels. So there's a sense of shared popular culture and shared experience. And certainly for some members of the audience, this would create nostalgia and a longing for the past. We're not necessarily shown that the past is a great thing though. All those images of war are pretty brutal and probably quite hard to justify for the modern audience. But it just goes to show what a tumultuous time the 80s was, a real melting pot of different things going on. And this, of course, is also reflected in the music. We have in this opening sequence a reggae track by Toots and the Maytals, which tells the story of someone getting out of prison, a bit like Combo. But throughout the film, and particularly in the sort of playground sequence, we see young people dressed in particular ways to represent their music. So we see different subgroups supporting their artists, supporting their music. Smell, I would say, is a bit more of a sort of new romantic in her look, for example. But the main subculture we see is the skinheads. This is what this film is about, and showing that skinheads haven't always been connected with racism. It's not until Combo comes on the scene that the skinheads become associated more with the National Front and with racism. Before that point, it's all about the music. It's about ska, it's about two-tone, it's about soul, and it's about that specific look and style that mark the skinheads out as a particular group. So overall, the opening montage feels like a celebration of music and of culture and fashion, lots of exciting and vibrant things happening in the 80s. However, we also have that darker undertone, that politics, lots of images of Thatcher, and ultimately Thatcher sort of led to the destruction of working class communities. So perhaps this film is about finding identity at a time when people's identities were almost being destroyed by what was happening politically. So my next frame is actually two frames, as you can see here, and I want to talk here about how Shane Meadows decides to present Sean's experiences in the two different gangs. In both group shots, we see Sean as being a central part of the group. In the first group shot, when he's in Woody's gang, he's almost central in the frame, and therefore that shows his importance. In the second group shot, his importance comes because of his relationship with Combo, and that arm around his shoulder shows that Combo has become a sort of surrogate father figure, but in quite a dangerous and controlling way. In the first group shot, Sean has more open body language, he looks more active within the group, and more independent, even though he is part of a group. In the second group shot, his actions look like they're more controlled by Combo, just by that hand on the shoulder. In the second group shot, he also looks less childlike, partly because of the costume, but also because of his posture and body language with his chin raised high. We know that in the first group shot, the gang are going to play football, they're going to hang out together, they're going to go swimming. There's a lot of time spent in this sort of equilibrium state where the gang functions really cohesively, and Sean is part of that. It feels like a really happy time, especially when we compare it to earlier on in the film when he's bullied for wearing his flares. He now looks the part of the gang, and he has a group of friends that are reliable. The gang seems really relaxed and quite kind, and they do normal sort of teenage things. There also doesn't appear to be as large an age gap as there is with Combo's gang and Sean. Woody's gang also seems much more inclusive. So Milky is an accepted and valued member of the gang, but we also have a group of girls that are part of the gang, and although they're not seen in this group shot, they're seen in the following frame in a similar formation, walking in the same direction. So it's important here to mention the St George's Cross that's overlaid across the image, and this is an example of where this type of realism is more poetic and cinematic than traditional social realism. We wouldn't see something like this in a Ken Loach film, for example, which remains very natural throughout. This obviously is making a statement about how involved Sean now is with Combo's gang, and as a result of that, the National Front. The flag obviously is symbolic at different times, and we'll talk about what he does with it at the end. But here, very visually, we've got this idea that everything that Sean is doing is coloured by these beliefs of the National Front and white supremacy. So I just want to finish this section by looking beyond Sean and looking at the whole gang. In the first gang, Woody's gang, everyone feels a little bit more individual. Everybody's walking slightly out of time with each other. They're messing around, and there's a sense that at some point Gadget might get pushed into that bush. They're clearly having a laugh, normal teenagers all together. In the second gang, in Combo's gang, we just need to see their facial expressions to see that we're all a lot more serious. If you compare Gadget in both scenes, you've got a real difference. Even though he's wearing the same, his face is very different. Also look at the leadership styles. Combo has to be front and centre, whilst Woody is quite happy sort of hanging back and letting the gang kind of get along without him having to show any kind of control. Here in Combo's gang, everybody is walking to the same beat. It's almost like they're marching along together, and they've got that clear sense of purpose. There's a reason why they're together that's linked to the St George's flag that we talked about before. Combo clearly sees his group as a sort of troop, a little army fighting a particular war. Woody's gang hang around together for fun, for messing around, for being teenagers. Combo's gang come together to fight against anyone who is of a different colour to them. They are formed together in a threatening way. They're dangerous when they're together, and that makes those shots of the gang quite frightening. So my next shot is perhaps not one that you would go, oh, that's a really important shot to the film. It's one that you might not even notice, but I've chosen it because I think if you're taking an ideological approach to any film, it's always good to think from a feminist perspective, or more broadly, a perspective that considers gender and gender representation. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that Combo's group doesn't include any women, but Woody's group does. Here, Combo, we can't see him, he's off screen, but Combo is sitting in his car waiting for Lol to come past. So already we've got this hyper masculine, aggressive male creating quite a tense and frightening atmosphere for our female characters. We can see Lol in the middle ground, but we can also see two other female characters in the background who are quite clearly in danger because of their ethnicity. If we look at the body language more closely, and if you look at this scene in the film, the body language here is hunched up. These characters are almost trying to make themselves smaller. And when you see the scene, you can see that they're very quickly hurrying past. Lol tells us that she's late for work. This is possibly an excuse. It's possibly true. But ultimately, all of these women are just trying to get through this quite frightening sort of abandoned alleyway location as quickly as they can. Now, the National Front has quite traditional, old-fashioned views on women and feminism. They see feminism as frankly ridiculous, and women should still be fulfilling that old-fashioned role of being in the home and bringing up children. So it's no wonder that any woman would feel vulnerable around a known member of the National Front. In the frames that follow, Lol does challenge Combo on some of his ideas, and she rejects his affection. So she's a very powerful character in that respect, but equally really quite vulnerable, and we don't at any time really feel that she's safe. We do see some vulnerability from Combo in the frames that follow this, when he becomes extremely emotional when Lol rejects him. And I think in terms of representation of gender, this shows that masculinity at this time during the 80s, when men were particularly vulnerable to unemployment and therefore not necessarily bringing home money to their families, it shows that masculinity is kind of in crisis. Combo doesn't really have any male role models apart from the men in the gang, so perhaps he feels confused about what it means to be sort of masculine and a male. And maybe that's why he's so vocally supportive when they go to the National Front rally and he sees this male role model in front of him. So all of this shows what a complex character Combo actually is. He's more than just a racist bully boy. However, it is important to note that Lol sees the night that they spent together completely differently to Combo, and potentially she has been a victim of sexual abuse. She tells us that she was 16 and she was drunk. Did he take advantage of her? It's clearly a really unpleasant memory for her. Despite being a powerful character, This Is England is not Lol's story. This is not a story told from the female perspective. We are aligned with male characters. We spend most of our time with male characters. We see gangs dominated by men. So this is really reflecting that patriarchal society of the 80s. And I want to develop that idea a little bit further with slide 4, with this image of Combo, Stephen Graham, back in the flat, and this is after he's had his moment with Lol. He meets up with Milky, takes him back to his flat, and to begin with, they are chatting and seem quite friendly. And then, of course, the situation changes, and Combo attacks Milky and nearly kills him. I'm going to say at this moment that I actually feel quite sorry for Combo, because he's come out of prison and no one is pleased to see him. Not really. Obviously, he has this gang of followers. But if you look at the reactions of Woody and Lol and those gang members, they know that his arrival back from prison is going to cause trouble. He appears to have no family, no genuine friendships. He is alone, but is quite clearly desperate to be part of a group, and perhaps that's why the National Front is so attractive to him. He also hasn't got a job like many men in the 80s, and of course he blames that on immigrants taking all the jobs, which is rhetoric that we still hear today. So he's looking for someone to blame for his misfortunes in life, and he finds an easy target because there's other people that he can join with and follow that sort of ideology. In many ways, he's just as misguided and just as keen to find something as Sean is. And as a character, he foreshadows what Sean will become if he keeps following this path. What I really want to focus on here is the elements of social realism. So we've got this very stark close-up shot of Combo. If you look at that lighting, which we assume is coming from an ambient source, it would suggest that there is a light bulb hanging in the room. No lampshade, none of that kind of soft lighting that we might see in middle class homes. This is all very stark. Look at the dirt on the walls and the scraping of the paint. This is a place that is uncared for. This is not a home. Alongside that, we've got Combo's hair and makeup, and in particular those prison tattoos, those homemade tattoos, which in themselves are quite threatening. Again, we've got the cross, which might link to the St George's flag that we talked about before, and of course as a symbol of the National Front. The fact that he's had them on his face at a time when people didn't tattoo their necks and faces just kind of marks him out as someone quite threatening. I also think all of these marks, these cuts on his face kind of show us a bit about what type of lifestyle he leads. He's obviously someone that gets into scraps and fights and possibly doesn't look after himself particularly well. Now, in the top third of this shot are Stephen Graham's eyes, and I think possibly the strongest thing for me in this film is Stephen Graham's performance. What we see in this series of close-ups with him and with Milky is how his facial expressions subtly change. As Milky is talking about his family, the size of his family, his mum's cooking, all of these lovely home comforts and kind of community that comes with being a large family, Combo looks more and more angry and more upset, actually. I think his eyes give away that he is saddened. He's possibly jealous, he's possibly angry about what he's hearing. This fits in with his ideology of black families having loads of children. You know, this is confirming these racist and bigoted views. But at the same time, it's telling Combo that community and love is part of those big families. And I think Combo is very jealous of that. So we see this build-up of rage in Combo through Stephen Graham's quite subtle performance. His face changes very delicately until he suddenly explodes. And this is just one of many moments where I think the performance is fantastic. And of course, the performance of Thomas Turgoose is also fantastic. And here we have, in my final frame, this really powerful shot of Sean looking straight into the camera. So here we see him breaking the fourth wall and looking directly at us, directly at the audience. And this is something we haven't seen him do throughout the film, and we don't normally see in social realism. When we break the fourth wall, we break that illusion that we are in that film world. This reminds us that we are onlookers watching events taking place. So it's really powerful that he makes this direct eye contact with us. So we have to think about why the director made that decision to get the actor to look up and look at us for that final high angle close-up shot. Now there are loads of reasons why this decision might have been made, but the brilliant thing about film studies is that you can get higher marks for suggesting different interpretations, and different spectators are going to see different things. This shot could be a symbol of escape. He's certainly escaping the confines of the film, confines of the frame. So maybe he's escaping sort of childhood and these ideas that have been pressed on him before. Maybe it suggests that he's learnt something. It's definitely a coming of age film, so he's made progress throughout the film. What has he learnt here? I certainly think it's challenging us, the viewer. I think we're supposed to think about our own positions, our own childhood, our own views on the world. There's so many things that we might be led to think about from this film. Maybe it's the director challenging us. We know that this film is semi-autobiographical. Sean Field is a thinly disguised Shane Meadows, so this comes from his childhood experiences. So maybe what we're seeing here is almost Shane Meadows staring back at us, challenging us, saying, look, I've presented this story to you. What are you going to do with it next? I think maybe this suggests disappointment. Sean was part of something, part of a group, and then he's let down by these older people. And possibly that's a reflection on how he feels about his father now. It certainly suggests that Sean is no longer innocent, and we could argue that he's never really been innocent, because during earlier scenes he's quite happy to fight back, he's often swearing, he's quite cheeky. So we could argue he's never sort of an innocent, naive child, but perhaps by the end some of his innocence about his father and his father's career, perhaps he feels slightly differently about those things. And obviously we see him throw the St George's Cross flag into the water, obviously rejecting that National Front ideology. But is it more than that? Because what we see when we cut to those shots of war and army members in the Falklands are very violent images, and this film does say something about what is acceptable violence and what isn't, and the idea of the other and the rhetoric around war. So there's lots of things that you can take from this final shot, and you might agree or disagree with some of the things there. If you're a student who's studied the 400 blows as part of your French New Wave, you'll perhaps take a different message and different reading from this final shot, because obviously it looks very similar to the final shot from that film. The 400 Blows by Truffaut is again a semi-autobiographical film. It's about a troubled youth, and it's about being trapped within the system and finding escape. So there might be links that you can make there. Ultimately, this final shot of the film is a really haunting one. It's really memorable, and even after the film is finished, Sean's face looking at us and challenging us is really memorable. And that earlier humour that the film started with is long gone. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little tour through This Is England. There is so much to say about this film, and I could have chosen another 20 frames to talk about, so do go away and choose your own as part of exam preparation. See you next time. Bye bye.